Welcome to History Nachos. We do things a little differently. Names and dates take a back seat to humanity's greatest real stories. So sit back and enjoy the ride. More than 4,000 years ago, human civilization dawned in the Middle East. As humanity developed, empires formed. 4 great powers ruled the known world. In the West, Egypt crafted the pyramids and pushed the boundaries of science. In the South, Babylon developed into a legendary cultural center. In the East, Elam rose to prominence and rivaled its neighbors. And in the North, Assyria became feared for its military. For over 1,000 years, these 4 nations fought each other for power and influence. Everything changed when Assyria completely devoted itself to world domination. Assyria built up its already formidable military and steamrolled its opponents. The Assyrians brutalized their neighbors to an extent considered excessive even by standards of the day. For many, life under Assyrian domination became unacceptable. Even though the armies had lost, conquered people started refusing to live in bondage. The time had come to rise up in arms. Welcome to Episode 11, The Ancient Revolution. Mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government. Thomas Jefferson. That quote is one of the most famous passages of the American Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was not putting forward a new concept, but expertly articulating ideas that go back to humanity's earliest civilizations. The resilience of human nature makes people able to endure suffering caused by their governments. But everybody has a limit. When a government crosses the line into flagrant tyranny, it risks passing the limit and causing a revolution. History is full of revolutions, but a major one is frequently overlooked. It occurred nearly 150 years before the foundation of democracy in Athens. This is the story of the ancient revolution against Assyria. Everything starts out in the ancient Middle East, and I mean Book of Genesis ancient. Assyria, Babylon, Elam, and Egypt were some of the earliest known empires. For this episode, I will call them the Big Four. Here is a brief overview of each one. Babylon, modern southern Iraq and Kuwait, a vibrant center of culture and learning protected by a formidable army. Egypt, the jewel of the Nile, their advanced culture traced back to prehistory. Egypt pushed the limits of science and architecture, but could hold its own in battle against the other powers. Elam, modern Iran. We know very little about Elam due to scarce records. However, we do know they had a powerful military because of their impressive collection of national treasures plundered from across the ancient world. And last but not least, Assyria, modern Syria and northern Iraq. A culture roughly similar to Babylon, but militaristic and cruel beyond belief. Fear of Assyria was one of the few things everyone in the ancient world could agree on. All but Babylon predate Abraham by centuries. Babylon was the newcomer because it started in about 1800 BC. There were also smaller kingdoms around, but they often stayed in the periphery or ended up in the hands of the Big Four. The Big Four stayed consistently powerful for over 1,000 years. Each of the Big Four would also trade off being vassal states to each other during periods of weakness, then rebel and retake independence when they got strong again. The tune would sometimes change, but the musicians stayed the same. During this time, humanity was still learning the basics of civilization. Horse riding was cutting-edge technology. The invention of using gold as money constituted advanced economic innovation. Warfare and conquest were pretty brutal. Battle often involved getting right up in someone's face, looking them in the eye and ripping into them with a sharp object. Losing a war could also mean total subjugation or destruction of your entire nation. The prevailing sense of morality and the value of human life is not something many people today would recognize. The modern value system existed, but was limited to a small independent kingdom named Israel. Much of this story is not good guy versus bad guy. It is bad guy versus worse guy. In the 900s BC, Assyria began to really amp it up. They started hugely building up the military in pursuance of a new goal: world domination. Assyria's military became incredibly powerful for several reasons. Their training, tactics, and military culture certainly played a part. The Assyrians also gained a huge technological advantage. While everyone else used bronze for their weapons, the Assyrians found something better: iron. Iron is way tougher and will literally cut into bronze. Fighting with bronze against iron was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Assyria started completely smashing their opponents. Assyria entered its prime, and that was not a good thing for the rest of the Middle East. It was such a huge change that from this point on, Assyria is considered to enter a whole new age. Today we call it the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Even in the harsh world of the ancient Middle East, the Neo-Assyrians gained a reputation as the most brutal of the bunch. They took pride in mutilating opponents and treating conquered peoples cruelly. We know because they triumphantly carved the scenes in stone and wrote down lists about exacting wrath. The extent of cruelty and human carnage for an average Neo-Assyrian king is considered on par with the 20th century's worst dictators. Survivors of an Assyrian conquest would often be spread all over Assyria's vast territory in order to destroy the native heritage. It was essentially forced assimilation to impose Assyrian law, culture, and religion. Other empires would do similar things, but Assyria took it to a whole different level. Most empires mainly wanted land, slaves, and resources. Assyria wanted all that, plus psychological trauma and total subjugation. Assyria's heightened brutality started to become a problem when it transformed into a military superpower in the 700s BC. The Assyrians built up their army and started seizing Babylonian territory. Over the course of the 730s BC, Babylon put up a good fight, but it was a losing battle. The Assyrians eventually ground down Babylon and brought them to heel. However, Babylon would always be a trouble spot for revolts, even after the Assyrian takeover. Remember that duty to rebel when a government becomes too despotic? The Babylonians totally bought off on that idea after seeing what living under Neo-Assyrian kings was like. An ongoing revolution through resistance had begun. It was like Redcoat occupied Boston leading up to the American Revolution. Even with all the revolts, Assyria still got Babylon's land and treasure. After acquiring Babylon's vast wealth and resources, Assyria was more powerful than ever. Assyria started taking out small kingdoms left and right. Roughly a decade after Babylon fell to Assyria, part of former Babylon briefly gained independence thanks to a bold leader named Merodach-Baladan. He was part of the old Babylonian royal family and was willing to keep fighting for independence despite the military defeat. Merodach-Baladan declared himself king of an independent Babylon and basically told the Assyrians to pound sand. 2 years later, Elam and Assyria started a huge war against each other, which became a more pressing threat than the rebellion. The war between Assyria and Elam ultimately ended in a draw, but it took the pressure off Babylon for a decade. After the threat from Elam calmed down, Assyria got back to business and marched south to retake Babylon. However, this time Babylon would not fight Assyria alone. Merodach-Baladan realized he and Elam had a mutual enemy in Assyria, so Babylon and Elam struck up an alliance. When Assyria came knocking on Babylon's door, Elam intervened. It is kind of like how France supported the American Revolution against the British. However, this time the plucky rebel alliance lost to the Empire. Merodach-Baladan somehow survived and continued to foment unrest. He even briefly took the Babylonian throne again. Assyria was so done with this guy, so they sent the army down to take him out once and for all. Merodach-Baladan had to flee to Elam and hope for political asylum. Elam instead killed Merodach-Baladan, which I personally think was a form of damage control for political relations with Assyria. It might have worked, because instead of launching another war, Elam and Assyria backed off from each other for a while. Going into the 600s BC, Assyria was pretty angry at Babylon about the whole rebellion thing. To make things worse, during the rebellion, Babylonians had captured and presumably killed the Assyrian king's son. Now it was personal. A blood feud against Babylon and its ally Elam had begun. Assyria needed to make an example of the rebellious Babylonians. Babylon's holiest temples and relics were pulverized. Even other Assyrians considered it distasteful, since the Babylonian gods were part of the Assyrian religion. However, the point had been made. After building up again for a couple of decades, Assyria decided to take out Egypt. In the early 600s BC, Assyria invaded Egypt. Egypt decided to fight back, but got steamrolled. Just like Babylon, Egypt kept revolting. That did not stop Assyria from taking the wealth and resources. However, Assyria did have to come in and wreak absolute havoc on Egypt's major cities several times before things calmed down. It helped that Assyria treated Egypt like a typical imperial expansion instead of a vendetta like Babylon. It was business, not personal. When Egypt asserted independence a short time later, the Assyrians let it go. Now, do not think Assyria was being generous. Elam was becoming a much more serious threat, so the Assyrians probably figured Egypt was not worth the effort and soldiers it would divert away from defending against Elam. In the mid-600s BC, Elam tried to disrupt Assyria internally by backing another Babylonian attempt at independence. It was led secretly by the Assyrian king's brother. He ruled as governor of Babylon. It was a consolation prize for not getting the crown. When Elam's army started moving towards Babylon, the main Assyrian king thought it was an invasion. To me, it sounds like a modern proxy coup gone wrong. Assyria and Elam went to war again. This time, Assyria sacked Elam's cities, killed the Elamite king and his son, then brought their heads back to decorate the royal palace. But Assyria did not keep Elam. Before an occupation could be set up, an alliance of minor kingdoms from the edge of the civilized world rushed into Assyria and threatened the capital. Assyria survived, but it needed to use other, tougher barbarians to get the job done. The Assyrian king's brother in Babylon also openly rose up in rebellion. It did not turn out well for him, and Assyria started dealing out more harsh consequences to Babylon. Assyria had not forgotten about Elam, though. The standing vendetta now became unfinished business. Soon after the Assyrians had killed the last Elamite king, Elam descended into civil war over the succession. The Assyrians saw a chance, so they swept back in to retake Elam. When Assyria invaded Elam, they went absolutely nuts destroying the place. This was not just about making an example. It was an extermination. And just like with Babylon, it was personal. Assyria killed or enslaved everyone they could find. They even took the farm animals. Assyrians salted the fields and planted thorn bushes everywhere so nothing could grow on the land anymore. Within a month, Elam became an uninhabitable wasteland. Just to add insult to injury, the Assyrians also exhumed the bodies of Elam's past kings and brought them back to Assyria. The kings' bodies were dishonorably buried in a foreign land, so their spirits would never again be able to rest. When the army returned triumphantly to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, the victory parade was straight out of a Saw movie. The dead Elamite king's head was proudly displayed. The Assyrians had also kept prominent Elamites alive for the sole reason of torturing them to death in Nineveh as part of the festivities. For example, several Elamite chieftains had their tongues ripped out and then were skinned alive. Elam's top general had to walk all the way across the Middle East in chains, with the Elamite king's head tied around his neck, before being tortured to death in Nineveh. Honestly, that all is just scratching the surface. The horrific sight caused Elam's ambassadors in Nineveh to go completely insane. One even killed himself on the spot. Even for the time, the Assyrians were acting sadistically evil. The very few survivors back in Elam found themselves in a pretty tough situation. Almost everyone had been killed or enslaved, and much of the land was now useless. However, Elam had one thing going for it. Elam was on the edge of the civilized world, so they shared a border with tribesmen and barbarians. One tribal kingdom in particular had begun to grow increasingly powerful: the Medes. Remember the coalition of tribesmen that almost took out Assyria? The Medes were part of that group. In the wake of Elam's destruction, the Medes began to move in on what was left of Elam. One vassal state of the Medes in particular culturally and politically merged with Elam through dynastic marriage: Persia. Whether the merger with Persia was a smart political move by Elam or simply due to conquest is debated. The records are pretty scant. The important thing is that when Persia and Elam merged, it combined Elam's sophistication with the muscle of the Persians and the Medes. Now the Medes took over where Elam left off. Over in Assyria, things were great. All of Assyria's enemies were vanquished, and Assyria dominated the known world. At least for a little while. There are indications Assyria began to decline in power over the next couple of decades, but the details of how and why are largely lost to history. We do know Assyria started losing control of its outlying territories. They just stopped following commands from the capital, but did not yet declare full independence. After seeing how Assyria handled Babylon, everyone knew the risk of open rebellion. Better to try civil disobedience first. Then the 620s BC hit Assyria like a train. Assyria's king died in the early 620s after running the empire for over 40 years. He was the same king who finished off Egypt, took out his rebel brother in Babylon, and destroyed Elam. The next generation just needed to maintain the already existing world domination. Instead, the king's two sons got greedy and fought over the crown. They started a succession crisis that resulted in a civil war. A civil war was the worst thing that could have possibly happened to Assyria. Babylon was getting strong again, and as always looking for a chance to become independent. Barbarians in the north began freely ransacking Assyrian territory. Elam had been revived and strengthened by combining with the Medes. Now the civil war took away Assyria's main advantage: its military might. Assyria was suddenly vulnerable, and its enemies were growing stronger by the moment. Most revolutions proceed slowly, for a long time, until suddenly things pick up and start moving lightning quick. The Assyrian Civil War is the turning point where the ancient revolution started to move quickly. Babylon at the time was governed by a man named Nabopolassar. He was a native Babylonian and had the people's support. After watching the civil war erupt in Assyria, Nabopolassar decided the time had come to push for independence. This was Babylon's best chance, so it was now or never. Nabopolassar declared Babylon independent, with himself as its king. He spent the next 10 years driving Assyrian forces out of Babylonian territory. At the same time, among the Medes, a man named Cyaxares took power. Barbarian tribes had taken over the Medes a few decades ago, but in 625 BC, Cyaxares killed all their chiefs and reclaimed his father's throne. He buffed up the military and could probably smell Assyrian blood in the water. In the 610s BC, Nabopolassar over in Babylon made another fateful decision. Instead of staying content with regaining Babylonian independence, he decided to play for all the marbles and actively invade Assyria. People from all over the Middle East flocked to Babylon to fight against Assyria. The revolution was on. Open warfare broke out. Centuries of built-up rage was about to be unleashed against Assyria. Even people from former Elam joined Babylon's invasion. They were like the American pilots who went to England in World War II and fought in the Battle of Britain before America entered the war. Cyaxares saw his chance to permanently take out Assyria, and the Medes invaded too. Once again, Babylon and Elam's descendants worked together against Assyria. The Assyrians fought viciously for their homeland. Egypt decided to ally with Assyria, but even with Egyptian help, the Assyrians were outmatched. The invaders steadily gained ground. One of their big targets was Ashur, Assyria's ancient founding city. The destruction of Elam was barely one generation before, so it was still fresh in the minds of the Mede soldiers. The Medes looted everything, killed tons of people, and destroyed the city. Right after the Medes finished rampaging through Ashur, the Babylonians arrived with the same idea in mind. Cyaxares and Nabopolassar struck up an alliance on the spot and prepared for a joint offensive against the biggest prize of all, Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. In May 612 BC, the joint army surrounded Nineveh, which was heavily fortified and filled with what was left of the Assyrian military. The siege lasted 3 months. When the defenses fell, all hell broke loose. Nineveh was looted and destroyed to an extent considered extreme overkill even by contemporaries. For a full month. A few die-hard Assyrians rallied for one more final battle, but they were defeated soundly. The last remnants of the mighty Assyrian war machine were gone. Word spread all over. Ding dong, the witch is dead. The ancient world erupted with joy and relief. The revolution had succeeded. Assyria would never rise again as a powerful nation. After generations of unprecedented despotism and cruelty, few wept for the destruction of Assyria. Now Babylon and the Medes ran the show. It was a tremendous improvement. The Medes would later become one of the most influential societies in human history. The Persian Empire. Ever since the fall of Nineveh, more than 46 centuries ago, the former nation of Assyria has been consistently one of the hottest conflict zones in the world. Even today, it is an incredibly dangerous land. If you look at a map of the Islamic State at the height of its expansion in 2015, much of its territory was the Assyrian homeland. During the Iraq War and the fight against the Islamic State, some of the heaviest fighting occurred in Nineveh. Today it goes by a different name, Mosul. Cyaxares and Nabopolassar deserve much more recognition than they receive. Their ancient revolution completely changed the face of civilization and kept humanity from going down the dark path Assyria laid out. However, both Cyaxares and Nabopolassar have incredibly famous descendants who are also prominent in the Bible. Regardless of your religion, the Bible is an incredibly important book both as a religious text and a historical reference for this time period. Nabopolassar's son is Nebuchadnezzar II. The alliance between Babylon and the Medes was cemented with Nebuchadnezzar's marriage to a Mede princess. Later, he would become the Babylonian king who conquered the kingdom of Israel, destroyed Solomon's temple, and deported the Jews to the captivity in Babylon. That was all relatively standard practice for the time, and less cruel than Assyria. Still bad, though. Daniel, as in the Book of Daniel, became one of Nebuchadnezzar's top advisors, and Nebuchadnezzar is a central figure in several of the Old Testament's most iconic stories. The great-grandson of Cyaxares is Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. Cyrus could easily have his own episode. He took over much of the Middle East without a fight by implementing a radical idea for the time: cultural tolerance. Naturally, it was backed by military muscle, which is how Cyrus conquered Babylon. Cyrus definitely had a few things in common with his revolutionary great-grandpa. Cyrus also played a critical part in the history of the Jews. When Cyrus took Babylon, he ended the Jewish captivity, started to rebuild Solomon's temple, and made Daniel a high official in the new regime. Isaiah 45 even explicitly states Cyrus was a ruler officially anointed by God. That is a big deal coming from a recognized prophet canonized in the Bible. Cyrus is easily one of the most influential leaders in human history. The consequences of the ancient revolution transcended generations. Even without the biblical events, the seeds Cyaxares and Nabopolassar planted would impact people on 3 continents for centuries to come. And it was all because they had the courage to stand against the great evil of their time. As always, we would love to hear your feedback and topic requests. Please comment, like, and share, or leave a review on iTunes so we can reach more people. You can also email us directly at historynachos@gmail.com. We have pages on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, and PayPal. For technological reasons, the older episodes are not on iTunes and SoundCloud, but are still freely available on YouTube. Please consider a donation to support making more episodes. Any amount is greatly appreciated. The links to everything are in the description. Until next time, thanks for listening.